Is it worth writing songs and making creative work if no one hears it?
What stops us doing our best work?
And what is the difference between those who succeed in writing songs and making music over the course of their entire lives and those who give up?
If these questions have ever bothered you or kept you up at night, stick with us, because in this video we want to share with you one book that addresses these three questions in such a profound way that it has changed the way we write songs and make music, and has fundamentally changed the way we think about making creative work.
The book is Art and Fear by Bales and Orland. David Bales and Ted Orland wrote this book in 1993. Both of the authors are art makers themselves, as well as teachers of art and art practice. The key question that this book addresses with such sensitivity and nuance is really, how do you maintain focus, discipline, motivation, self-worth, and a sense of value in your own art making, not only over the long term, but often in the face of making something and having its reception by the world be perhaps less than what you had hoped and dreamed for that work?
And importantly, how do you find joy in the work that you make and sustain that work regardless of how well it's received by other people? We can't possibly do this whole book justice, but what we do want to share with you today are three key takeaways and talk about how you can apply these principles to your own creative work and songwriting.
Number one, focus on the process, not the outcome. To all viewers but yourself, what matters is the product, the finished artwork. To you and you alone, what matters is the process, the experience of shaping that artwork. The viewer's concerns are not your concerns, although it's dangerously easy to adopt their attitudes. Their job is whatever it is, to be moved by art, to be entertained by it, to make a killing off it, whatever. Your job is to learn to work on your work.
This quote beautifully sums up one of the core principles that runs through the whole book, and that is this idea of finding nourishment in the work, finding intrinsic value and reward in the doing, not worrying about the outcome.
One of the parts of that quote that I love the most is the idea that these two things are dangerously easy to conflate with each other. It's so easy to trick yourself into finding value in your work, in its reception, in the response of other people, in likes, in streams, in views, in monetary reward. But I think what's so important is understanding that the value of creative work is so far beyond any dollar amount or any stream number amount. There is so much value in the doing of the work itself.
And a big part of this is understanding there are things you can control and there are things you can't control. You can't control how people will feel or respond. You can control your own process. And this is really what the authors of this book dig down on. They talk a lot about your relationship with your work, your relationship with your own process. And what they seem to care most about is how you can develop a good, loving relationship with your own process so that you can keep doing it regardless of what other people think.
One of the key ideas that comes out of this that has been so valuable to me and us as songwriters is the idea that the success of your work is really in what it teaches you about your own work and what it shows you that you can work on next.
The function of the overwhelming majority of your artwork is simply to teach you how to make the small fraction of your artwork that soars. And they really talk about this a lot in the book, that no one artwork or no one creative work is that important compared to the body of work that you're creating. They're all just stepping stones. They're just a piece of the bigger puzzle.
And when it comes to songwriting specifically, one of the things that we encounter so much, both in ourselves and also the many, many hundreds and thousands of songwriters that we interact with, is ways in which songwriters self-sabotage by actually judging their work too quickly, by being inside the process, but shutting it down before it's even had a chance to flourish or become something. That they're at the beginning of the songwriting process. They've written half a song, but suddenly they kick in with this expectation of what they were hoping the song would be compared to what it is at this moment. And when that critical judgmental voice starts to evaluate any piece of work according to the absolute pinnacle of your taste, suddenly it's really, really easy to just shut the whole thing down and say, look, if it can't be exactly this thing that I want it to be, is it worth doing at all?
And the painful result of this is just folders full of half-finished songs. And we hear this frustration so often that people have a lot of great ideas, they've got a lot of great starts, they just don't have many finished songs. The truth is that the piece of art which seems so profoundly right in its finished state may earlier have been only inches or seconds away from total collapse. The point being that we need to finish to find out, because sometimes in the middle of the process we don't know, or we feel like it's not going very well, and then literally moments later it's all going really well. And we do not want to rob ourselves of the opportunity to create something beautiful, create something we're proud of, by feeling halfway through that it's not going that well and pulling out of the process too early. Number 2, learn how not to quit. Basically, those who continue to make art are those who have learned how to continue, or more precisely, have learned how not to quit.
I love this quote and this moment so much because I think it really tracks beautifully onto the reality of making creative work over the long term, which is that making creative work over the long term is not this continued, consistent flourishing of creative epiphany and bursting joy and enthusiasm and inspiration.
Sounds good though. That sounds great.
Pretty good, but it just doesn't actually exist. Over the long term, what we do need is a sense of craft and discipline. We do need to have tools and processes that we can rely on in those moments where inspiration is off having a nap.
And this really begs the question and prompts us all to ask this question of ourselves: how do we not quit? What do we need to do? What practical steps can we take? What processes can we engage to stop us quitting? Because the reality is, anyone who has tried to do this, anyone who tries to write songs or make art or really any kind of creative endeavor, knows that you go through up and down periods, and the down periods can feel pretty bad. And if we throw into the mix pressure that comes from working in certain industries where you feel like you're not getting the feedback you'd love, or you're feeling despondent about your own work through critical analysis, that makes it even harder. So this question of how do we keep going? How do we not quit? How do we develop a relationship with our own work that feels joyful enough to want to keep going? This is a big question.
I think the other question is, how do you keep going past your early 20s when you're full of ambition and fantasy and, to a certain extent, an amount of delusion about what a career as a musician or a songwriter could potentially look like? Like, what if that doesn't work out? What do you do at that moment? Do you just give up, or is there another pathway? So rather than this all just being really philosophical and reflective, they give some really practical tips on how you can maintain and sustain your motivation and your desire for doing this work over the long term. One of the things that I really appreciate in this book is the idea of finding a venue for your work. Now, venue does not mean a pub on the corner. It doesn't mean a stage or a theatre. It's not like venue in that sense. What they mean is somewhere for your work to go.
And if it's not going to be a physical venue, we have to ask the question of what else could it mean? It could be a songwriting group. It could be a space where you share your work with other songwriters. It could be that you're writing to a brief or responding to a brief and putting forward your work for consideration. The main thing here is to think about where your music can go so it doesn't stay with you and get stuck inside you. It's about giving it some sense of purpose, some sense of motion, because the opposite can be very demotivating.
Another way we can think about venue is giving yourself deadlines and due dates and really committing to that in some kind of public way that institutes accountability into that process. So it might be actually announcing to whatever community you have around you that you are going to release an EP by this date. Now, of course, that should be reasonable and achievable, but by actually setting that date, you put the wheels in motion.
And really, another way to think about venue is community. It's about having people around you that you can share your work with so that the process of creating your work doesn't feel so isolating, so you don't feel so alone in what you do. Another huge reason people seem to quit is perfectionism, or they identify as being perfectionists and they cite perfectionism as the reason they can't finish their songs, or they can't keep going, or it's not quite what they wanted it to be, and so they stop.
But perfectionism, as we all know, is really just fear of failure kind of dressed up pretty. Ansel Adams was right. To require perfection is to invite paralysis. Believing that artwork should be perfect, you gradually become convinced that you cannot make such work. You are correct. Sooner or later, since you cannot do what you are trying to do, you quit. And in one of those perverse little ironies of life, only the pattern itself achieves perfection, a perfect death spiral. You misdirect your work, you stall, you quit.
What I love about this chapter in the book is they actually go into a little bit of detail about the difference between stopping and quitting, and really talk about this idea that stopping is a natural part of the creative process. Quitting is definitive. Quitting is fundamentally different from stopping. The latter happens all the time. Quitting happens once. Quitting means not starting again, and art is all about starting again. I love this quote so much. Art is all about starting again, because it really acknowledges the inevitable ebb and flow, the ups and downs that is just part of any creative process. Some weeks you're flying, the ideas are flowing. You can't imagine the ideas ever drying up. And then next week it's all stopped. You're dry and you can't really imagine where the next idea is going to come from. Stopping and stepping away and then coming back to your process, coming back to your craft. This is part of what we do. This is inevitable.
3, focus on doing your best work, not on pleasing others. Fears about making art fall into 2 families. Fears about yourself and fears about your reception by others. Fears about yourself prevent you from doing your best work, while fears about your reception by others prevent you from doing your own work.
Wow. The title of the book is Art and Fear, and the authors do not shy away from talking about what fear really means. And in this quote, we hear 2 really deep and fairly heavy concepts laid out, and the consideration for the artist or the songwriter really is significant here. Like, what stops us doing our best work and what stops us doing our own work? These are probably 2 challenges that you never stop trying to overcome.
So let's address this idea of fears about ourselves. Like, what is that and where does that come from? The biggest fear I think that we and songwriters have about ourselves is that we don't have enough talent. We don't have the X factor. We don't have the it that is going to help us achieve some vision of success that we have for ourselves. There is probably no clearer waste of psychic energy than worrying about how much talent you have, and probably no worry more common. The world is filled with people who are given natural gifts, sometimes conspicuously flashy gifts, yet never produce anything. And when that happens, the world soon ceases to care whether they are talented. What is so impactful to me about this idea is that the real question is not how much talent you are given. The real question is how much motivation do you have to establish habits, discipline, and craft that actually cultivate whatever talent you do have.
And this is why they're so hell-bent on process. And this is why they spend so much time talking about process and sustaining that process, because really that is a far bigger determinant of whether or not you create work that you can be happy with than talent. So let's come back to the second fear from that earlier quote and look at how worrying about how well your work is received can prevent you from doing your own work. And this begs the question, who are you making the work for, or why are you making the work? We understand that part of songwriting and part of building a career in this space is, serving an audience. Are you making the work for other people and what you think they want? Are you chasing certain trends, or are you making the work that really feels good and authentic and real to you?
Becoming an artist consists of learning to accept yourself, which makes your work personal, and in following your own voice, which makes your work distinctive. The tension here, though, is that it's a very natural and innate part of making this kind of work, songwriting, that really wants an audience, that really wants that connection and that communion with other people. I think a lot of songwriters start songwriting and continue songwriting because of that joy and profound experience you have when you make something that connects with someone else, when you kind of write something authentic and really hit that spot. And then that moment happens with someone else where your truth touches on their truth, and in really valuing yourself and being able to express that thing, someone else feels seen and heard. And that is actually the magic of what we're doing. So the tension here is not saying, ignore audience and that the audience and reception and the connection with an audience is irrelevant. It is relevant. But I think what they're really trying to say is that to do it over the long term, focusing more on the process and more on establishing and developing your own authentic voice and vision and really tuning into that is the thing that will create that connection that we all really want with listeners.
And I think the really big point that they want to make is that if you let other people's opinions or views of your work stop you making your work, this is the real tragedy. That the only reason you stop making work is because you want to stop making it for your own reasons, not because of how well or how poorly your work is received. Acceptance and approval are powers held by others. Both acceptance and approval are, quite plainly, audience-related issues.
The real talk component of this is that, we are songwriters talking to songwriters, and songwriters like writing songs because they like people listening to their songs. I think that that's really important to acknowledge. And I think that a lot of songwriters write songs because they might have some dream or ambition of lots of people listening to their songs. And it's not a bad ambition. It's not that that's inherently negative. But I think it's so much more important to really have a sense of joy and worth in the work itself. Because I think if the reason you are writing songs is to be rich and famous, that's going to dry up real quick.
And even when you do hear some of these successful and rather famous songwriters talking about their process, it's not the money or the fame that seems to keep them going. The thing that keeps them going is their love of the process. It is that they have found a way to continue enjoying what they do, regardless of everything else. In the end, it all comes down to this. You have a choice, or more accurately, a rolling tangle of choices between giving your work your best shot and risking that it will not make you happy, or not giving it your best shot and thereby guaranteeing that it will not make you happy. It becomes a choice between certainty and uncertainty. And curiously, uncertainty is the comforting choice. Did we finish with that?
I think so.
Did we just finish with that?
Yeah. That's great.
Okay.